Shots fired! Shots fired! Where the fuck is Oscar?
Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot about this game on social media already. It seems like every gaming YouTuber in the fucking world has covered it by now, but I haven't yet, so that's what we're going to do today. Unrecord is going to be a narrative-driven first-person shooter where you play as a tactical police officer. It's been kind of described as a mix of Firewatch and Ready or Not, which sounds interesting. You'll do detective work and solve criminal cases and get in some pretty intense firefights too throughout the game. It'll have like a branching storyline and you'll have to make quick decisions in some encounters. Sometimes you'll have to face tough moral dilemmas and complex dialogue options, which honestly, you know what, that's all pretty standard for a game these days. But the narrative, the dialogue options, and the mission structure aren't what make this game special. Obviously, the reason everybody's talking about this thing is the ridiculous level of realism it's bringing to the table with its presentation. The whole game is visualized through the perspective of their body cam. You're not actually looking through the character's eyes, it's through the perspective of their body cam. There's visual effects layered on top of the image that distort it to mimic a wide-angle lens, and blow out the highlights from direct sunlight to simulate the camera's auto-adjusting exposure and some other things. Add on top of that the incredibly detailed hand animations and the arm movement, and it all comes together to make a game that looks scary real. Like seriously, there's been some real talk online from media outlets about this game asking if we finally crossed a line here. To be fair to them, it can be very difficult to tell, especially for people who have little to no knowledge about gaming and or visual effects, and I'm not really surprised at all that this footage is setting off alarm bells. Getting into it and starting off with the graphics, it's an Unreal Engine game, and like I just mentioned, it relies a lot on visual trickery and small details to convince you. I'll leave a link to his video in the description, but LevelCap pointed out that the environment they used for the original demo a few months ago was a pre-made Unreal Engine asset that looks just fine on its own, but after layering the camera lens distortion and exposure effects and hand animations on top, it completely changes the tone and makes it much more quote-unquote realistic. Depending on where you look in-game, sometimes they blur or just outright wash out the background to the point where it doesn't exist. And when the player transitions their view from far to near, it's done pretty seamlessly, and it results in very believable footage. Like one specific scene I'm thinking of is right at the beginning of the demo actually, when the player is walking up to the building. They kind of turn so that their left shoulder is up against the wall where the door is, and their view is kind of pointed off in the distance towards the horizon with the sun in the background and everything. And you can see the effect of like the automatic exposure on the camera trying to work and kind of blowing out the sky a little bit, and it makes it so that you can't really see distant objects. But then the player transitions down to look at their weapon and eventually moves into the building, and then everything comes back into focus. And all the details and textures that are close to the player, they all look great, of course. Unreal is inherently very good looking. Another visual effect that the developers take advantage of here is blurring the enemies' faces. It's a pretty obvious effect, right? You notice it immediately. But it's also one of those subtle effects that you don't really realize what it's doing to your lizard brain. It actually contributes to the developer's goal of wanting to make you believe that what you're seeing is real. Even though it's an obvious visual effect, it makes you think it's more real because in scary real-life body cam footage, people's faces are often blurred. The audio is another key aspect of what makes the game feel so intense and quote-unquote realistic. In the gameplay demo, which is linked in the description by the way, loud sounds like gunfire have a more realistic profile versus a more gamey type of sound. You know what I'm talking about. It sounds boomy and reverby and slightly distorted instead of that pew-pew, very artificial video game type sound. Also in clips where the player sprints, you can hear the rush of air, ruffling of clothing brushing up against the body cam, and the character's heavy breathing too. Again, all sounding just a little mildly distorted to help sell the realism. Enemies yell at the player and to each other, and their voices echo believably according to the environment they're in, whether it be a small room or a larger, more open space. Another important ingredient is the hand and weapon animations, which are really impressive. The developer said that the weapon manipulation is painstakingly keyframed instead of motion captured, and the result comes out to be much more believable. That sounds like a massive pain in the ass, to be honest, but you know what? I'm glad they did it because, well, the results kind of speak for themselves, don't they? Also, just the sheer authenticity of how the character handles their weapon. Now, I'll be the first one to admit that I'm no firearms expert, but the way they clear malfunction, for example, definitely adds a lot to the experience and shows the devs have a pretty good understanding of firearms. which you definitely want in an FPS, especially one like this. The game leverages all of these effects and brings them together to create some truly heart-pounding gunfights. They can kick off very suddenly as enemies pop out from behind cover and dart from one point to another, and you're encouraged to match them using speed, aggression, and importantly discipline while you play. All of this actually does kind of remind me of Ready or Not, just a little bit on steroids. The most interesting thing about Unrecord is that gameplay-wise, there's nothing really happening here that hasn't been done in countless other FPS games. But when you break the whole thing down piece by piece, you come to an important distinction, which Levelcap said in his video, and I completely agree with him. Link to his video, again, is going to be in the description. The developers are trying to make something here that looks like real body cam footage, not real life. There are plenty of games out there today that are leveraging new graphics engines and hardware to make the most detailed and visually stunning environments and characters we've seen yet. But nothing's innovated quite like this before. By building upon a pretty standard game environment and experience with lots of visual and auditory trickery, they've managed to convince most of the world, not just gamers, the world, that what we're looking at is real when in fact it's not. And that's a huge milestone in gaming. You can follow the development team on social media. Links to those and everything else I talked about are in the description. Thanks a lot for watching, guys, and I'll talk to you in the next one.
Where the fuck is Oscar?